By the time World War II entered its most violent phase, the myths had already taken shape. The war was no longer remembered as fragile or uncertain. It was remembered as decisive, as a sequence of great clashes where victory turned on bold commanders, heroic sacrifices, and iconic battles. That memory is misleading, because once the war began, it was not battles that determined the outcome. It was systems, logistics, production, command structures, error tolerance, the ability to absorb loss without collapse. In Part 1, we dismantled the myths that shaped how the war is remembered. In Part 2, we examine how the war actually worked, and we begin with one of the most persistent misunderstandings of all. History textbooks are built around battles for a reason. They are dramatic, they are visual, they provide clean turning points. Names like Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein, and Normandy feel like hinges of fate, moments where everything changed. This framing is seductive, and it is deeply incomplete. World War II was not decided by decisive battles. Battles revealed outcomes that had already been shaped elsewhere. To understand why, you have to separate tactical events from strategic causation. Battles are where violence concentrates. They are not where wars are fundamentally decided. Germany did not lose the war because it lost Stalingrad. Japan did not lose the war because it lost Midway. These defeats mattered, but they mattered because they exposed systemic weakness, not because they magically reversed the war's trajectory. The obsession with decisive battles comes from hindsight. Once the outcome is known, historians and audiences instinctively look for moments that feel like turning points. But turning points are often recognized only after the system has already shifted. In real time, these battles did not feel decisive. They felt desperate. Consider Germany's situation by the time of Stalingrad. Long before the encirclement, Germany's strategic position was deteriorating. Supply lines were overstretched. Fuel shortages were intensifying. Manpower losses were compounding. Industrial output was under pressure. The German system was already absorbing damage faster than it could repair itself. Stalingrad did not create these problems. It exposed them violently. The German army at Stalingrad fought with extraordinary determination, but determination does not replace fuel. It does not replace transport. It does not replace reserves. Once the note came due, no amount of tactical brilliance could prevent collapse. The same pattern appears again and again across the war. Battles mattered because they accelerated processes already underway. They did not reverse them. This is why focusing on battles alone produces distorted understanding. It implies that if a battle had gone differently, the war would have gone differently. In most cases, that is not true. A different outcome at Stalingrad might have delayed German defeat. It would not have solved Germany's structural problems. A different outcome at Midway might have prolonged Japan's offensive reach. It would not have fixed Japan's industrial imbalance or fuel dependency. Wars are not balanced on knife edges as often as popular memory suggests. The real determinants were quieter and far less cinematic. Logistics decided where armies could fight. Production decided how long they could fight. Training pipelines decided whether losses could be replaced. Command systems decided whether mistakes could be corrected. Germany and Japan both built systems optimized for rapid success. They did not build systems optimized for sustained attrition. The Allies did. This difference became decisive long before the famous battles were fought. Another reason the decisive battle myth survives is that it simplifies responsibility. If wars are decided by a handful of moments, then failure can be blamed on lost opportunities, a bad decision, a missed chance, a single commander's mistake. This is psychologically easier than accepting that entire national systems were misaligned with the demands of modern war. But modern war is not a duel. It is a process, and processes favor endurance over brilliance. Allied strategy increasingly reflected this reality. Rather than seeking one perfect blow, the Allies applied pressure across multiple domains: air, sea, land, production, finance, and morale were all targeted simultaneously. The goal was not to win one battle, but to ensure the enemy could not recover from cumulative loss. Germany and Japan, by contrast, repeatedly sought decisive engagements that would restore the situation. Each failure deepened exhaustion. This is why decisive battles loom so large in memory, but mattered less than we think. They are where systems break in public. By the time Normandy occurred, Germany's fate was already constrained by industrial imbalance, air superiority, fuel scarcity, and manpower depletion. Normandy mattered because it accelerated collapse, not because it created it. The war was already decided in factories, shipping lanes, training camps, and logistics depots long before soldiers stormed beaches. The myth persists because it flatters drama. Battles are easy to narrate. Systems are not. But if you want to understand World War II, or any modern war, you must reverse the emphasis. Battles tell you when collapse became visible. Systems tell you why collapse was inevitable at that point. And once you understand that distinction, the war stops looking like a sequence of heroic clashes and starts looking like what it truly was: a competition between systems under sustained pressure. In the next section, we dismantle another illusion: the belief that strategic bombing and intelligence dominance decided the war cleanly, because even the most powerful tools of modern warfare were far less decisive than memory suggests. Few ideas about World War II feel as intuitively true as this one. Cities in ruins, factories destroyed, entire populations living under constant air attack. From a distance, it looks obvious. Destroy the enemy's industry, break civilian morale, and the war collapses. This belief shaped how the war was fought. It also shaped how the war was remembered. And it is deeply misleading. Strategic bombing did not win World War II in the way it is commonly imagined. It did not collapse societies on schedule. It did not reliably break morale. And it did not function as a clean substitute for ground combat. What strategic bombing actually did was far more complicated, far more ambiguous, and far more uncomfortable than the myth allows. To understand why this myth persists, you have to start before the war even began. Long before the first bombs fell, air power theorists believed that future wars could be decided from the sky. They argued that modern societies were fragile, that civilians, once subjected to sustained bombing, would panic, revolt, or force their governments to surrender, that destroying industrial centers would cripple war production faster than armies could advance. These ideas were not fringe theories. They shaped doctrine in Britain, Germany, Italy, the United States, and Japan. By the late 1930s, many leaders genuinely believed that air power could end wars quickly and cheaply. World War II became the first large-scale test of that belief. The results did not match expectations. Early bombing campaigns revealed a fundamental flaw in the theory. Modern societies were far more resilient than anticipated. Civilian morale did not collapse on command. Populations adapted. Production dispersed. Governments tightened control. Fear did not automatically translate into surrender. This was not immediately obvious to planners. Bombing campaigns escalated, partly because leaders believed results were just one more push away. More bombers, more payload, more cities. But escalation did not produce clarity. German bombing of Britain during the Blitz failed to break British morale. British and American bombing of Germany devastated cities, but did not collapse industrial output in the way predicted. Japanese cities burned, but Japan continued to fight. This is not to say bombing was ineffective. It is to say it was not decisive in the way memory suggests. Bombing disrupted production, but rarely eliminated it outright. Factories were damaged, repaired, relocated, or dispersed. Workers adapted. Output fluctuated but often recovered. Even under intense pressure, war economies proved remarkably elastic. This forced a shift in interpretation after the war. Instead of admitting that strategic bombing theory had been flawed, narratives evolved to frame bombing as necessary, inevitable, and ultimately decisive. Destruction became proof of effectiveness. Civilian suffering became retroactive justification. The moral discomfort of mass. Bombing was resolved by declaring it essential, but the historical record is less forgiving. Bombing did impose enormous costs. It forced the enemy to divert resources into air defense, repair, and dispersion. It strained transportation networks. It consumed fuel and manpower. It shaped strategic decisions. What it did not do consistently was produce immediate strategic collapse. And this distinction matters. The myth of decisive bombing encourages the belief that technology can bypass the political and military complexity of war. That destruction alone produces submission, that societies will behave predictably under terror. World War II demonstrated the opposite. Societies under bombardment did not behave as air power theorists expected. Fear often produced cohesion rather than rebellion. Civilian suffering hardened resolve as often as it weakened it. Governments used bombing to justify repression, mobilization, and sacrifice. This resilience was not moral heroism. It was survival psychology. Another layer the myth hides is how bombing campaigns themselves evolved. Early bombing was inaccurate. Targets were missed. Civilian areas were hit unintentionally. Over time, bombing became more deliberate, more systematic, and more destructive. This escalation was not driven purely by effectiveness. It was driven by frustration. When bombing failed to deliver decisive results, the solution was not reassessment. It was intensification. This created a feedback loop where destruction increased faster than strategic clarity. And yet, even as cities burned, enemy systems adapted. Germany dispersed industry. Japan decentralized production. Underground facilities multiplied, signaling redundancy. The war economy bent rather than broke until other pressures accumulated. This is the crucial point the myth avoids. Bombing mattered because it interacted with other systems. It did not operate independently. Bombing was effective when combined with blockade, ground pressure, resource denial, and systemic exhaustion. Alone, it rarely delivered decisive results. By the later years of the war, bombing campaigns became more effective not because bombing itself had suddenly matured, but because enemy systems were already strained by cumulative loss. Fuel shortages, manpower depletion, transportation collapse, and territorial loss amplified bombing's impact. Bombing accelerated collapse. It did not create it. The same applies to the moral narrative. Strategic bombing is often remembered as a tragic necessity, a terrible tool required to defeat an even worse enemy. This framing avoids a harder truth. Bombing doctrine was built on assumptions that proved wrong, and once proven wrong, were rarely abandoned. The war did not validate air power theory. It exposed its limits. This does not mean bombing was pointless. It means its role must be understood accurately. Bombing forced adaptation. Bombing drained resources. Bombing shaped strategy. But bombing did not offer a shortcut to victory. Another reason the myth survives is institutional. Air forces emerged from the war with enormous prestige. They had demonstrated relevance, reach, and destructive power. Admitting that strategic bombing had not delivered decisive victory threatened institutional identity. Post-war doctrine evolved to emphasize lessons that preserve the centrality of air power. History was interpreted through organizational self-interest. This is not unique to air forces. It is how institutions remember wars. But for historical understanding, it matters. Because the belief that bombing alone can win wars continues to influence strategy long after World War II. It encourages over-reliance on technological coercion and underestimation of political, social, and systemic resilience. World War II showed that even the most devastating bombing campaigns cannot reliably force surrender without complementary pressure. The war ended not when cities were destroyed, but when systems collapsed completely. Germany surrendered when its territory was overrun, its command structure shattered, its economy broken, and its leadership incapacitated. Japan surrendered under a unique convergence of bombing, blockade, invasion threat, and geopolitical shock. Bombing was part of these processes. It was not the process itself. The myth of decisive bombing survives because it offers moral closure. It suggests suffering had a clear purpose. It suggests destruction was efficient. It suggests there was no alternative. History rarely offers such comfort. The reality is more unsettling. Enormous destruction occurred within a strategy that was only partially effective, poorly understood in real time, and deeply shaped by flawed assumptions. World War II did not prove that bombing wins wars. It proved that modern societies are harder to break than planners expect. And that lesson, like so many others from the war, is often ignored because it is inconvenient. In the next section, we dismantle another illusion, the belief that intelligence agencies saw everything, understood everything, and guided the war with hidden omniscience. Because information did not produce certainty. It produced confusion. Modern memory treats World War II intelligence as almost supernatural. Codebreakers decoding enemy plans in real time. Spy networks penetrating the highest levels of command. Intelligence agencies guiding strategy from behind the scenes with near-perfect awareness. In this version of the war, information flows cleanly. Decisions are informed. Victory comes from knowing more than the enemy. This belief is one of the most seductive myths of the entire conflict. And it is profoundly misleading. Intelligence did not provide clarity during World War II. It provided fragments. Sometimes those fragments were decisive. Often they were confusing. Frequently they were ignored, misunderstood, or arrived too late to matter. Intelligence was not a master key that unlocked victory. It was one input among many, filtered through bias, institutional friction, fear, and uncertainty. To understand how intelligence actually functioned, you have to abandon the idea that information automatically produces insight. It does not. Intelligence is only as useful as the system that interprets it. And during World War II, those systems were deeply flawed. Start with a basic reality that popular narratives avoid. Intelligence agencies did not operate in a vacuum of rational decision-making. They operated inside governments already committed to strategies, assumptions, and political pressures. Information that aligned with expectations was welcomed. Information that contradicted them was often resisted. This is not incompetence, it is human. Before the war, intelligence failures were already visible. Warnings about German rearmament were debated rather than acted upon. Signals about Japanese intentions were filtered through racial assumptions and strategic disbelief. Information existed, but interpretation lagged. This pattern continued throughout the war. One of the most misunderstood aspects of intelligence is the difference between collection and use. Collecting information is one problem. Using it effectively is another. World War II intelligence services collected enormous amounts of data: intercepts, reports, reconnaissance, human intelligence, signals intelligence. But raw information does not speak for itself. It must be evaluated, prioritized, and acted upon, all under time pressure. And this is where intelligence often failed. Consider signals intelligence, often portrayed as the crown jewel of Allied success. Code-breaking operations produced remarkable breakthroughs, but decoding messages did not automatically translate into operational advantage. Intercepted communications were partial. They required context. They required validation. They competed with other information streams, and they often arrived after decisions had already been made. Even when intelligence was accurate, it could still be ignored. Commanders frequently distrusted intelligence that contradicted their plans. Political leaders filtered information through ideological lenses. Bureaucratic rivalry delayed dissemination. Security concerns limited who could see what. Information did not move freely. It moved cautiously. The myth of omniscient intelligence survives because post-war narratives emphasize successes while quietly burying failures. We remember the moments when intelligence worked because those moments are dramatic. We forget the countless times when intelligence warned, hesitated, or failed, because those moments do not produce clean stories, but those failures mattered. Intelligence agencies repeatedly misjudged enemy intentions, capabilities, and timelines. They underestimated resilience. They overestimated collapse. They mistook adaptation for weakness. They confused silence with ignorance. One of the most damaging assumptions was the belief that better information would naturally produce better decisions. In reality, better information often increased uncertainty. More data did not simplify choices, it complicated them. Conflicting reports created paralysis. Partial insights produced false confidence. Intelligence that arrived without context created noise rather than clarity. This is why intelligence is better understood as a force multiplier, not a substitute for strategy. It enhances existing systems. It does not replace them. Another uncomfortable truth the myth avoids is that intelligence success often depended on enemy mistakes rather than intelligence brilliance. Codes were broken because procedures were sloppy. Networks were penetrated because security was uneven. Information flowed because the enemy underestimated risk or overestimated its own secrecy. When those mistakes were corrected, intelligence advantages diminished. Intelligence dominance was not permanent, it was fragile, and this fragility shaped decision-making. Leaders knew that intelligence advantages could vanish at any time. This uncertainty limited how aggressively intelligence could be exploited. Revealing knowledge risked exposing sources. Acting too decisively risked alerting the enemy. So, intelligence was often used cautiously, indirectly, or partially. This is far from the omniscient image popular culture prefers. Another myth is that intelligence provided foresight. In reality, intelligence was often reactive. It explained what had already happened more clearly than it predicted what would happen next. Warnings about major enemy actions existed throughout the war. But warnings are not predictions. They are assessments with margins of error. Acting on them requires judgment, and judgment carries risk. Leaders who act too early risk embarrassment. Leaders who act too late risk disaster. World War II is filled with examples of intelligence that was technically correct, but operationally unusable. Information that lacked precision. Signals that conflicted with other indicators. Reports that arrived without confirmation. The belief that intelligence agencies knew everything collapses once you examine how decisions were actually made. Strategy was driven by production capacity, manpower availability, logistics, and political constraints long before intelligence refined execution. Intelligence informed decisions. It did not control them. And intelligence agencies themselves were shaped by institutional competition. Rivalry between services limited cooperation. Information was hoarded. Credit was contested. Errors were concealed. This is not unique to wartime intelligence. It is structural. The myth survives because intelligence offers a comforting illusion that someone, somewhere, understood the war fully. But the truth is harsher. No one understood the war fully while it was happening. Leaders acted under uncertainty. Commanders made decisions based on incomplete pictures. Intelligence clarified some dangers while obscuring others. The fog of war did not lift simply because information existed. It thickened. And yet, intelligence mattered enormously, just not in the way the myth suggests. It mattered because it reduced uncertainty incrementally. It mattered because it improved efficiency over time. It mattered because it helped systems adapt. But intelligence did not eliminate surprise. It did not prevent catastrophe. It did not provide omniscience. The war ended not because intelligence unlocked victory, but because enemy systems collapsed under cumulative pressure. Intelligence accelerated that process. It did not replace it. This distinction matters because the intelligence myth teaches the wrong lesson about power. It encourages the belief that information dominance equals control, that knowing more guarantees success. World War II demonstrates the opposite. Information without resilient systems produces confusion. Information without institutional adaptability produces paralysis. Information without strategic alignment produces noise. The intelligence successes of World War II were real. So were its failures. And understanding both is essential if the war is to be remembered as more than a cinematic puzzle solved by clever minds in dark rooms. In the next section, we move even deeper into the belief that wars are ultimately decided by morality, clarity, and righteousness, rather than by human limitation and structural pressure. Because the final myths of World War II are not about weapons or intelligence, they are about ourselves, resistance movements occupy a sacred place in World War II memory. They are remembered as unified, heroic, and strategically decisive. Small groups of civilians sabotaging rail lines, assassinating officials, passing intelligence, and rising up against occupiers, often portrayed as a hidden force that meaningfully turned the tide of the war. This image is emotionally powerful. It is also heavily romanticized. Resistance did not win World War II in the way popular memory suggests. In many cases, it did not significantly alter the strategic balance at all. That does not diminish the courage of those involved. It clarifies the limits under which they operated, and those limits matter because misunderstanding resistance turns moral admiration into historical distortion. To understand resistance accurately, you have to begin with its conditions. Resistance movements operated in environments designed to crush them. Occupied Europe was saturated with surveillance, informants, curfews, checkpoints, reprisals, and collective punishment. Every act of resistance risked not only the life of the individual, but the lives of families, villages, and entire communities. This reality shaped resistance more than ideology ever did. Resistance was rarely unified. It was fragmented, localized, and often divided by politics, ideology, ethnicity, and personal rivalry. Communist groups, nationalist groups, royalist groups, and independent cells often distrusted each other as much as they distrusted the occupier. Coordination was uneven. Resources were scarce. Communication was dangerous. The myth of a single, coherent resistance movement is largely a post-war construction. In real time, resistance was fragile and episodic. Sabotage occurred, but its impact was often temporary. Rail lines were damaged and repaired. Bridges were destroyed and rebuilt. Assassinations removed individuals, but rarely dismantled administrative systems. Occupying powers adapted quickly, increasing security and brutality. In many cases, resistance actions provoked devastating reprisals that outweighed their immediate tactical effect. Entire villages were destroyed. Hostages were executed. Civilians who had no involvement in resistance were punished collectively. This created a grim calculus. Resistance leaders had to weigh symbolic value against civilian cost. In some regions, restraint was chosen precisely because escalation would produce catastrophic retaliation. In others, resistance intensified because repression left no alternative. These choices were not moral abstractions. They were survival decisions under impossible conditions. Another distortion the myth introduces is scale. Resistance movements rarely had the manpower, equipment, or mobility to challenge occupying armies directly. They could harass, they could disrupt, they could gather intelligence, but they could not replace conventional military force. When resistance movements became militarily significant, it was usually because external conditions had already shifted. Allied armies approached. Air superiority increased. Supply drops expanded. Occupying forces weakened. Resistance became more visible when victory was already approaching. This timing matters. Resistance did not generally create liberation. Liberation created space for resistance to expand. Post-war narratives often reverse this causality. Resistance is portrayed as the engine of liberation rather than as a force that grew in the shadow of advancing Allied power. This inversion flatters national memory, but obscures strategic reality. Another uncomfortable truth is that most occupied civilians did not resist actively. This is not because they supported occupation. It is because survival demanded accommodation. People worked, traded, complied, and adapted. Resistance required extraordinary risk tolerance, and most people could not afford that risk. The myth of universal resistance erases this reality and replaces it with a binary: heroes and collaborators. Real life was far more complex. Many people existed in gray zones. They complied publicly and resisted privately. They avoided involvement altogether. They made compromises to protect families. They navigated occupation without ideology. Judging this behavior through a heroic lens misunderstands what occupation does to societies. Resistance movements were composed of minorities, brave minorities, operating under extraordinary pressure. They were not representative of entire populations, and they did not function as alternative governments capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. Where resistance mattered most was not in defeating armies, but in shaping post-war legitimacy. After liberation, resistance narratives became politically vital. They provided moral continuity. They allowed nations to emphasize defiance rather than accommodation. They helped heal wounds and restore identity. This does not mean resistance was invented. It means its importance was amplified. This amplification gradually transformed resistance into a decisive force in memory rather than a constrained one in reality. The myth also ignores how resistance effectiveness depended heavily on geography. Mountainous terrain, forest, and remote regions offered concealment. Flat, urbanized areas offered far less opportunity. Where resistance thrived, it did so partly because the environment allowed it to survive. This was not a universal condition. Resistance success was contextual, not inherent. The strategic impact of resistance was therefore uneven. In some areas, it meaningfully disrupted logistics late in the war. In others, it achieved little beyond symbolic defiance. Both realities coexist, but popular memory tends to flatten them into a single heroic narrative. Another distortion lies in the idea that resistance movements were primarily focused on defeating the occupier. In reality, many resistance groups were already positioning themselves for post-war power. Political rivalries shaped actions. Some groups conserved strength rather than risk annihilation. Others targeted rivals as much as occupiers. Resistance was not purely about liberation, it was also about future control. This complexity is uncomfortable, so it is often omitted. Understanding resistance accurately does not diminish its moral weight. It increases it. It recognizes that these movements operated under conditions where success was unlikely, and punishment was almost guaranteed. Their courage lay not in strategic decisiveness, but in defiance under hopeless odds. But when resistance is mythologized as decisive, it distorts how wars are actually won. World War II was decided by industrial capacity, logistics, manpower, and system endurance. Resistance interacted with those forces at the margins. It did not replace them. Resistance mattered most when it aligned with external power. When it acted alone, it paid an extraordinary price for limited effect. This is not a judgment. It is a clarification. The danger of the resistance myth is that it suggests wars can be won from below, through moral will alone. World War II shows that will without power produces suffering, not victory. The war ended when occupying systems collapsed, not when resistance reached critical mass. Resistance movements illuminated the moral landscape of the war. They did not determine its strategic outcome, and remembering them accurately honors their sacrifice far more than turning them into legends that history cannot support. In the final section of Part 2, we confront the last illusion, the belief that World War II was lived with moral clarity rather than with fear, compromise, and uncertainty. Because the most enduring myths of the war are not about armies, they are about human behavior under extreme pressure. One of the most powerful illusions surrounding World War II is the belief that people living through it understood its moral meaning as clearly as we do now, that choices were obvious, that good and evil were easily distinguishable, that individuals and societies knew in real time which side of history they stood on. This belief is comforting. It is also deeply misleading. World War II was not lived with moral clarity. It was lived with fear, uncertainty, compromise, and incomplete information. The moral certainty associated with the war was constructed afterward, once survival made judgment safe. To understand this, you have to separate retrospective morality from lived experience. From the vantage point of the present, the war appears stark. Nazi Germany is recognized as criminal. Aggression is condemned. Genocide is understood as absolute evil. In hindsight, alignment feels obvious, but people living in the 1930s and 1940s did not experience history as a finished narrative. They experienced it as a sequence of urgent problems, each demanding a decision under pressure, often without clear alternatives. Moral clarity requires distance. Distance did not exist. Most people did not know how the war would end. They did not know which regimes would survive. They did not know which compromises would later be judged as crimes or necessities. They acted within the constraints of survival. This reality is deeply uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that moral behavior is simple under extreme conditions. For civilians, the war was not a moral referendum. It was a daily negotiation with danger. Occupied populations had to decide how to eat, work, protect families, and avoid remembering the wrong things at the wrong time. Compliance was often indistinguishable from collaboration. Resistance was often indistinguishable from suicide. These were not abstract choices, they were immediate. A factory worker did not choose between good and evil. He chose between working and starvation. A shopkeeper did not choose ideology. She chose between staying open or disappearing. A parent did not choose political purity. They chose whether to expose children to retaliation. Later, moral judgments often ignore this context. The myth of moral clarity turns survival into virtue or guilt, depending on outcome. It assumes people should have known what future historians would conclude. This expectation is unrealistic and unfair. Even governments lacked clarity. Allied leaders made decisions that were morally ambiguous in real time. Strategic bombing knowingly killed civilians. Alliances were formed with regimes whose values were deeply troubling. Borders were redrawn with little regard for the people affected. These decisions were justified as necessities, and in many cases they were. But necessity is not the same as moral certainty. Leaders chose between bad options, not between good and evil. This is one of the most difficult truths of the war. Moral compromise was not an aberration, it was routine. The myth also collapses once you consider how information flowed. News was censored. Rumors replaced facts. Propaganda distorted reality. Atrocities were known partially, inconsistently, or not at all. People did not possess the comprehensive knowledge that later judgments assume. Expecting moral clarity without information is anachronistic. Even within authoritarian regimes, belief was not uniform. Many people supported governments for reasons unrelated to ideology: stability, fear, habit, opportunism. Others opposed quietly. Some shifted positions as circumstances changed. Human behavior under extreme pressure is adaptive, not principled. This does not absolve crimes. It explains how they became possible. Another dimension the myth ignores is time. Moral clarity often emerges only after patterns repeat. Early warning signs are rarely understood as such. Radicalization happens gradually. Laws change incrementally. Violence escalates in steps. People adjust as conditions worsen, often believing they are making temporary accommodations. By the time clarity becomes unavoidable, choices are already constrained. This is how societies slide into catastrophe without recognizing the moment they cross the line. The war's moral landscape was also shaped by fear of the alternative. For many, The question was not, "Is this right?" but, "Is the alternative survivable?" Fear does not produce ethical reasoning, it produces calculation. This is not weakness, it is human. Post-war narratives often erase this ambiguity because ambiguity complicates heroism. Nations prefer clean stories, resistance over compliance, courage over fear, unity over division. These stories help societies heal, but they distort reality. World War II became a moral template partly because it needed to be. The scale of destruction demanded meaning. Clear villains and heroes provided that meaning. But clarity achieved through simplification comes at a cost. It prevents societies from recognizing how easily moral boundaries erode under pressure. It encourages the belief that people will know better next time, despite evidence to the contrary. The most dangerous part of the moral clarity myth is that it suggests morality is automatic when stakes are high. History shows the opposite. Under extreme pressure, morality becomes fragile. It requires protection, reinforcement, and institutional support. When those supports fail, behavior adapts to survival. World War II was not a test passed by humanity. It was a demonstration of how easily systems and individuals break. And that is the lesson the myth refuses to teach. Understanding this does not diminish the moral significance of the war. It deepens it. It shifts focus from judgment to prevention, from condemnation to structure. If moral clarity only arrives after catastrophe, then the real ethical challenge is recognizing danger before clarity exists. That is why World War II matters. Not because it proves people will choose correctly when evil is obvious, but because it shows how rarely evil is obvious when choices still exist. The war was not lived as a clear moral struggle. It was lived as an accumulation of compromises made under fear, and remembering that truth is more important than preserving comforting illusions. By the time World War II ended, the world believed it understood what had happened. The war was explained through victories and defeats, through great leaders and decisive moments, through intelligence triumphs, heroic resistance, and moral certainty. But those explanations came later. What you've seen in this part of the series is the war as it actually functioned, not as it was remembered. A war shaped less by brilliance than by endurance, less by clarity than by confusion, less by morality than by systems operating under pressure. Battles did not decide the war on their own. Bombing did not deliver clean victory. Intelligence did not provide omniscience. Resistance did not overturn occupation by itself. And moral clarity did not guide people in real time. The war moved forward through fragmentation, improvisation, and compromise. Decisions were made without full knowledge. Choices were constrained by fear, logistics, and survival. Outcomes were shaped by structures that either absorbed stress or collapsed under it. This is the part of World War II that rarely survives in memory, because it is uncomfortable. It reminds us that catastrophe does not require stupidity or evil intent alone. It requires systems that cannot correct themselves, institutions that reward loyalty over truth, societies that adapt to danger instead of confronting it early. World War II did not unfold as a story of heroes who always knew what was right. It unfolded as a warning about how easily certainty disappears when pressure rises. And that warning does not belong to the past, because the final transformation of World War II happened after the fighting stopped. In the next part of this series, we examine what came next, how the war was remembered, reshaped, and weaponized, how myths hardened into national identities, how victory narratives erased complexity, and how the memory of World War II became a political tool that still shapes the world today. The war did not end in 1945, it changed form. This was Part 2 of the WW2 Declassified series. Part 3 explores how World War II was rewritten after victory, and why those myths still matter today. Subscribe to WW2 Declassified and continue with Part 3.